Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today, we're going to be talking about some pet peeves that I have around quilt pattern writing. I am a tech editor and ghostwriter, and I've written over 300 patterns and tech edited about that many more. So I read a lot of patterns on a daily and weekly basis. And as a result of that, I've got some opinions about how quilt patterns should be written and how best to write them for maximum readability. Because at the end of the day, all of this is for your customer. It's not for you. You don't need a pattern. You can figure it out yourself. Your customer is the one that's paying to get the instructions and everything written out for them to make it as easy as possible so that they can enjoy the quilting process and not have to think too hard about it. So that's really how we should be approaching pattern writing in general. And there are some things that I've picked up on over the years that really bother me because I think it interferes with that. It interferes with the ability of your reader to kind of fully digest the pattern and enjoy it. And that's not a good thing. So the first one is hyphenating words. This is like probably the thing that irks me the most. And this is a great example of it right here on the top left, right? You've got diagonal hyphenated. Now that's 4 syllables. Okay, maybe you need it hyphenated, maybe you don't. I would argue you don't, but I've seen words like corner or triangle hyphenated as well. And come on, do we really need to hyphenate a 2-syllable word? I mean, it just makes it harder to read, right? Because you've now got this dash in the middle of your word and the rest of it's on another line somewhere else. Like, why do that? It also ruins your white space, right? Because the end of that line would otherwise be like changing the length because we're having to shift words around so that they're not hyphenated, right? So if we can't fit the word, we move it to the next line. And that creates differences in the length of your line, which helps your eye keep track of where you're at in the pattern easier. So it's actually a really good thing to have that. Don't try to just like keep all of the block completely the same length and then add these hyphens in your words. It's not helpful. Just get rid of it. In most layout softwares like InDesign or Affinity Publisher, there is a setting that you can add. In InDesign, at least, it is on your paragraph styles to basically get rid of all hyphens that are in words that are not over a certain length. It's really easy. It's just a set it and forget it kind of thing in your template. So just do that. Get rid of them. Stop hyphenating your words. The next pet peeve of mine is around dimensions. So I see a lot of folks that don't like trimming, right? And so they'll make like a 2 at a time HST method, and in order to not have to trim those, you have to be really precise, which most people aren't, but you also have to use an 1/8 inch increment because that's just the way that the math works out for half square triangles. And so you end up cutting like 3 3/8 inch squares or something along those lines. Most people are not accustomed to cutting 1/8 inch increments. Most quilting rulers are not set up for it. So if you can, avoid it. Sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes there's things like, the no waste flying geese method where there are some quirks that pop up if you don't keep those squares proportional. And usually that means one of them has to be an 1/8 inch increment. So, I get it. If you have to do it. But in general, if you can avoid an 1/8 inch increment, do that because nobody enjoys cutting them. They're really hard to maintain precision on them. The difference between, 3/8 and 1/2 inch is really, really small. That's like a little tiny sliver, right? And so it's just really hard to maintain that kind of precision, especially when those are not the major markings on your rulers. A lot of times you will not have an 1/8 inch grid on your ruler, so it's just really hard to get everything aligned precisely. So just avoid it if you can. This next one is regarding cutting tables. And this is a hill that I will die on, folks. You need to have cutting tables. Don't just list out everything else. Sometimes you can get away with it. What I have here is an example of something that doesn't have a cutting table. And if you're only doing one size, like it's not the end of the world, but cutting tables always make this more organized. So if you can, use a cutting table. Just get into the habit of it. You can never go wrong with a cutting table, but there are lots of ways that you can go wrong without a cutting table. But if you're doing more than one size, it's absolutely mandatory. How do you keep that organized and make it really easy for your reader to digest without putting all of your cutting instructions in a table? So this is a good example of it, right? We've just got the fabric names bolded, and then you've gotten all of the instructions to the right just kind of listed out in paragraph form. And it's not too bad for this example because we are really only cutting a couple different sizes per fabric. But if you're cutting, 6 or more sizes, this gets really lengthy and it can be hard to follow. So just dump it into a table and use cutting tables instead. They almost always will enhance a pattern. This kind of 4th bullet point is the one that really irks me, and that is not providing cut and subcut instructions. So what I mean by this is not providing like a cut X number of width of fabric strips and then subcut them into X number of squares and rectangles, right? I've seen an increasing number of patterns that don't do this, right? They just list the number of shapes that you need, right? So you need 14 squares of a certain dimension and 15 rectangles of another dimension, right? And there's no instructions for how to get to those pieces from your yardage. Don't do that, guys. The reason most people are purchasing a quilt pattern is because they don't want to have to do the quilt math, right? Most quilters, especially if this is not their first rodeo, if they've been quilting for a couple of years, can figure out a lot of patterns by themselves, right? It's not an incredibly difficult skill. There are a lot of people that can do it, and a lot of people that'll just kind of make up their own patterns, right? Even if they're not writing them and publishing them. So if they can do that on their own, why do they need to buy your pattern? Well, they're buying it because they don't want to deal with the quilt math. They want you to do that for them so that they don't have to think too hard when they're quilting and they can just enjoy the process. So if you're not providing that for them, you're still making them do quilt math in the form of figuring out how to cut down their yardage efficiently and accurately into the correct number of pieces. Why did they pay for your pattern? Do you see where I'm going here? Like, this is really, really critical. This is why most people are purchasing your pattern. So don't get lazy. You need to figure this out for them. That is part of being a pattern designer. If you're struggling because it's a scrappy pattern or because you're struggling with math or, different quirks and things about designs, like not everything kind of fits into the typical quilt pattern format, right? With all of the quilt math. And that's okay. I've got lots and lots of videos about how to deal with those kinds of special cases. So definitely check out the rest of my YouTube channel for that. But it's not optional to just be like, well, you're on your own, have fun, right? That's why people are purchasing your pattern. If you don't have that in there, you're going to end up with a grumpy customer, and that is the last thing we want. Alrighty, this last one is another one that is a hill that I'm beginning to be willing to die on, and that is basically writing out each assembly step as adding individual pieces instead of just kind of grouping it together into a set of horizontal and vertical seams. So I've seen this a lot. People think on beginner patterns that their readers need this, right? They need to know that they're sewing this piece to this piece first, and then in another step, there'll be another set of directions where you're sewing this piece to that piece, right? And then you repeat this process for the second row and the third row, and then you sew these rows together, right? And this simple block assembly becomes 2.5 pages of instructions sometimes. And what it does is just adds a lot of repetitiveness to the pattern that makes it hard to read because it feels like you're reading the same instruction over and over again, which you pretty much are, right? There's just minor differences. And so that just encourages skimming. And if people skim, they're more likely to miss things. But it also just makes, a 30-page pattern where you're just having trouble keeping track of where you are in the pattern. And, for beginners, you could argue that they don't necessarily know that you can attach these 3 pieces all at once. Fine, that's a fair argument. But I would argue that kind of having it written out like this makes it really hard even for beginners to understand where they're at in the pattern and what the next step is because they're just having to work through so many different pages and so many similar instructions. So the better way to do this is once you have all of these kind of subunits assembled is that you'll have an instruction where you'll say, lay out all of your pieces as shown, right? Reference your diagram below. The diagram might look something like this. So you lay out all your pieces as shown, and then you're going to sew them into rows, press your seams, and then sew the rows together into the finished block. Those might be 2 or 3 steps, right? You can break it up differently if you want to. That's totally fine. But then you just have this diagram, right? You don't have this row by itself and 3 different sets of pieces added. So you've got basically, these first 2 pieces getting added together into half of the unit, and then a third piece added together into this top row, right? And then you're repeating it. It gets really difficult to read, and that makes the pattern feel so much harder than it actually is and than it needs to. And that's not what you want, especially if it's a beginner. So I will always, always, always recommend to my tech editing clients that you just kind of have a layout instruction, right? Here's the layout. Here's how your pieces are going to go together. And then we're just going to work to sew them together piece by piece until we have the finished block. Super simple. Alrighty, those are my 5 or so pet peeves. I do have others. I've got a lot of pet peeves when it comes to quilt patterns. That is a side effect of being a tech editor, but I will keep the rest of those to myself for now. But these are the main ones that I think really impact the readability and usability of the pattern and ultimately your reader's experience, which is, again, what this is all about. You are writing for your reader. You're not writing for you. Always keep that in mind. And if you do, you're probably going to make the right choice when it comes to how to write your pattern. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you like and subscribe if you found this video helpful, and I will see you back here next week for another Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.